Shark movies have a reputation for not being very good, but why is that? 2 words. Jaws. No wait, that's 1 word. Released in 1975, Jaws is quite simply an iconic piece of film history, and to this day, I've never watched it. Yeah, sorry, let me just rectify that real quick. Monstrous confession aside, Jaws is widely known as the undisputed king of all shark movies, primarily because it was the first one. The movie was so successful that it quickly spawned numerous copycats, and from what I see, the general consensus for these films appears to be a little negative, but a decent majority have accumulated their own followings, in at least some form, and one of those is a late 90s science fiction horror called Deep Blue Sea, and it's actually pretty good. Produced with a budget of just $60 million, it performed fairly well, grossing over $160 million worldwide. Critical reception was initially mixed upon release, and it was often compared to other movies with similar setups, like Jurassic Park and even Jaws. That's crazy! But as time went on, it slowly became known as the best non-Jaws shark movie of all time, and having recently rewatched it, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's a dumb, entertaining, and thrilling shark movie with Samuel L. Jackson. That's basically all you need to know going in. And check out the tagline: bigger, smarter, faster, meaner. I wish whoever wrote that a very pleasant evening. Strong contender for hardest movie taglines. Deep Blue Sea follows a team of scientists working laboriously to find an Alzheimer's cure by using their research on mako sharks. But after some very illegal genetic manipulation, the sharks become smarter and quickly execute a plan to break out into the ocean. But check out the YouTube movies and TV description. A beautiful scientist on the verge of making medical history. She's a 4 on the good day. The opening itself is a little similar to what you see in Jaws, except one major difference is how everyone on the boat survives the attack. And as for the shark itself, we find out it belongs to an underwater facility nearby that's owned by Aquatica, where Dr. Susan McCallistar, who is played by Saffron Burrows, is working hard to find an Alzheimer's cure in an effort to potentially reactivate dormant brain cells similar to those found in patients with the use of mako sharks. It also turns out that same shark managed to escape the facility, forcing the financial backers to send corporate executive Russell Franklin, played by Samuel L. Jackson, for an investigation, and it goes as well as you'd expect. The first 30 minutes are purely focused on setting everything up, and in the process you start getting a little attached to some of these characters. The 3 sharks also die in a variety of different ways. The first one is blown up by a lighter, the second is fatally electrocuted, and the third is also blown up but to a much larger scale. The overall concept kind of reminds me of Half-Life, a video game that also features a scientist trying to survive an alien invasion within the facility after a failed experiment. But unlike Half-Life, Deep Blue Sea has its characters escape an underwater facility that's been taken over by sharks as a result of a failed experiment. And what's funny is how all of this could have been avoided if some dumbass didn't stick his hand near a shark. It also reminds me a bit of Alien, where the mistake of one person leads to a series of horrifying events. Though to be honest, Jurassic Park is probably the better comparison to make, as both movies share very similar themes, while Alien itself is a different case. But I suppose it still makes for an adequate comparison, as they belong pretty much in the same genre. The story mainly follows typical conventions of which you'd find in not just a shark movie, but a horror film too. Some understandably take issue with this, but a number of people, including myself, don't mind this approach. In fact, it managed to actually surprise me with its own set of subversions. One common trope within these films is the expendable cast of characters. In a movie involving multiple characters either facing against or running from fierce creatures, a majority of them are typically disposed of through various means. There are a lot of ways in which you can kill these characters, and a lot of them are pretty predictable. Even the Alien movies fall victim to this, and so does Deep Blue Sea. But much like Alien, they give these characters plenty of time to flesh out their personalities and making you actually care, thus increasing the impact of their deaths as they inevitably become shark food. And seeing as we're currently on that topic, I think now's the best time to mention a particular scene that's known for subverting people's I think now's the best time to mention a particular scene that's known for subverting people's expectations when they least expect it. Russell Franklin's death was crazy, and I still saw it coming. I mean, when you position your camera that close to someone's face as they're standing right next to a pool of water in a movie featuring killer sharks, then it's pretty obvious that person is going to die. The scene itself, however, is still very good. It's a bit of a corny speech, but I like it. It's also in character for Franklin, as the speech itself is specific specifically intended to motivate the remaining survivors, and it makes more sense when you take into account how Franklin had previously survived a devastating avalanche. His sudden death is also a strong reminder that no one is safe. Literally anyone can die, but on the opposite side of the spectrum, anyone can still survive. Let's play a game. Excluding Franklin, who do you think is most likely to survive in a situation like this? If you said anyone other than Carter and Preach, you're dead wrong. Now Carter himself was already obvious from the start, as we're shown he's capable of dealing with these kinds of scenarios thanks to his incredible survival skills, while on the other hand you have Preach, who was initially introduced as a goofball working as a chef, spending a majority of his time in the kitchen with a parrot that swears all the fucking time. Going in, I did not expect this guy to survive being trapped inside a functioning microwave, a massive explosion obliterating an entire kitchen, and being dragged across by one of the sharks, only to subvert my expectations in the end by letting him live. This man truly has the power of God on his side.
If this is a lesson about the drinking, let's just say I've learned.
Normally you wouldn't expect a comic relief character to survive in a horror film, but I guess they wanted to shiver my timbers or something like that. As for the ending, it was initially going to feature 3 survivors, Carter, Preach, and Susan herself, a decision that wasn't received very well in test screenings. Those who saw the film hated the idea of Susan living to the end, as she was deemed the instigator of the events that occurred as a result of her little experiment, or simply put, they viewed her as the villain. This would result in a subsequent one-day reshoot where they instead kill her off as opposed to letting her live, and showing a kiss scene with Carter, which sounded pretty dumb. I'm glad they took that shit out. Another cool thing about the ending is the LL Cool J song Deepest Bluest. The song itself is incredibly corny, and I kinda like it that way. The lyrics are stupid as hell but entertaining at the same time. My hat looks like a shark's fin. What does that even mean? But it's not the only music piece from Ladies Love Cool James. Yeah, that's what it stands for. Say What is another song by James that made its way into the film, and it can only be heard towards the end. My honest reaction? On its own, the production history behind Deep Blue Sea is pretty interesting. The idea for the film was originally conceived by Duncan Kennedy, an Australian screenwriter who witnessed the horrifying events of a real shark attack near his home. This later contributed to a series of nightmares involving him being stuck inside a passageway with sharks that could read his mind. This would soon motivate him to write a spec screenplay on the concept, which would later be purchased by Warner Brothers in 1994. Development, however, didn't start until a couple years later, with the script having faced multiple rewrites by the time Rennie Harlin was chosen to direct. Now Harlin had a specific goal in mind for the project. He wanted to take back the horror genre to the big scale movie making level of films like The Exorcist and The Shining, which is one hell of a stretch, but okay. The movie also presented a challenge for Harlin, as one of his previous features at the time became one of the biggest financial disasters in Hollywood history. But lucky for him, Deep Blue Sea was a big enough success to keep his career going. Shooting began a year prior to release, and a majority of the footage was done just below the US-Mexico border, utilizing the large water tanks originally constructed for James Cameron's Titanic. And for the sharks themselves, both animatronics and CGI were used throughout the film, with the latter primarily coming to play for sequences that were likely too difficult for a physical machine to seamlessly execute. The differences between these two can be a little jarring once you notice them, but they're also easy to get behind knowing the budget and technology that it had to work with, so in that regard it's completely excusable. The sharks don't even have a lot of screen time, and when you do see them, it's likely an animatronic doing all the movements. The machines themselves were as tall as 26 feet, slightly larger than those used in Jaws, which according to Duncan Kennedy were 25 feet. Big difference. Remember when I said a majority of the film was shot near the US-Mexico border? Well, hopefully you do, as the remaining scenes were actually done at the Bahamas. The reason for this was so the crew could shoot their scenes with real sharks, as the overall idea was to mix them in with mechanical and computer generated sharks as an attempt to create a seamless transition between all three. They pulled a similar strategy with Sherman Dudley's pet bird, using 2 identical parrots for 2 different purposes, one for sitting down and one for flying around. This was because the production team could not afford to have a fully trained parrot for just just a few scenes, so they instead resorted to having a pair of identical birds, which isn't nearly as noticeable compared to the 3 sharks they prominently featured. As I mentioned earlier, the film features a cast of expendable characters, a disposable cast if you will, but does that in any way make them bad? Putting aside the forgettable secondary characters, Deep Blue Sea has a decent main cast. According to Harlan, the film's casting was heavily influenced by Ridley Scott's Alien, for a setup that made it almost impossible for the audience to accurately predict who was going to survive. I mean, I wouldn't say impossible, but carry on I guess. The influence is definitely something I can see now, as only recently have I actually gotten around to watching the series. His goal was to cast relatively unknown actors who possessed the ability to deliver solid performances and meet physical demands, with at least one known star to tie it all up. Samuel Jackson plays the role of Russell Franklin, and he was originally supposed to play Preacher, but his management team apparently didn't like the idea of him taking on the role of a motherfucking chef, and as a result, the character Franklin was created specifically for him. Russell Franklin, as you already know, is a corporate executive initially sent to investigate the facility. He also dies halfway, but you already know that. For a corporate executive, Franklin makes for a more positive portrayal to a vast majority of those who are typically shown through negative portrayals of corporate higher-ups in other media. I think it's because Franklin is shown to actually give a damn, while also interacting with the other characters in a way that makes him just as human, and having survived an avalanche in the Alps, it helps us connect with him on a surface level, unlike a certain someone. Susan McCallistar is not a good character. I do not like her at all. It's perfectly understandable why people view her as the villain. I mean, she deliberately hid the truth from everyone about the genetic tampering that inevitably caused the facility to be attacked and flooded by increasingly intelligent sharks, and when confronted on this, she insistently doubles down on her decision for most of the film, claiming that her research will save lives, despite the fact that her research has just fucking killed various innocent people, and she barely seems to give a shit. I think the biggest issue with her is the acting. Susan is a bit of a boring character with little charisma for me to connect and sympathize. Her lack of facial expressions are so stiff that it makes her feel less emotionally convincing than Sonny from iRobot. A robot felt more human than a human herself. Rise of the Apes is a movie that features a similar type of character with similar goals and ambitions, but why of all franchises did I suddenly pull up Planet of the Apes? Well, compared to Susan, Will Rodman is a much better character. He's a lot easier to connect with because you watch him actively struggle while desperately trying to develop an Alzheimer's cure to help his dad, as opposed to just being told about it. And while he did inadvertently cripple humanity with both the ALZ-112 and 113, he never really doubles down on his actions, instead questioning the legitimacy of the drug he developed after noticing the negative long-term effects it had on his father, thus receiving a harsh reality check. This adds another layer to his character that allows the audience to sympathize with him, and in addition to all that, James Franco delivers a significantly better performance than Saffron Burrows. It's generally a lot easier to sympathize with a character who expresses actual human emotion as opposed to just this. Other facility members include Preacher, Carter Blake, Janice Higgins, and Tom Scoggins. And before you ask, there's a reason for why I'm deliberately leaving out Brenda and Jim. They both die in the first 35 minutes, and we rarely get a good glimpse into their characters apart from the occasional brief moments. It's not to say they're bad, as I think they're okay enough, but I don't really count them as part of the main cast, or to elaborate, those who make it past the 40-minute mark. For reference, the film is over 90 minutes long, so they only live for around 40% of the runtime. No wait, that's a much bigger portion than I thought. Yeah, you know what, let's just do them. There isn't much to discuss anyways. Brenda is the supervisor thingy who oversees the facility from the watchtower, if that's what you call it. I don't know, I'm fucking dumb. Literally nothing to say here aside from her death, which I thought was pretty goofy. And then we have Jim Whitlock, who is the doctor assisting Susan at the start. He later dies at the hands of his own creation, which is pretty ironic.
He's pissing into the wind. How brilliant can he be?
Enough to stick his hand inside a shark. His romantic partner is Janice Higgins, and she's a marine biologist. She's okay. I kinda feel bad for her. She witnesses the brutal demise of her partner Jim, who gets thrown against a glass window by a shark while still conscious. That's horrible. She too faces a gruesome end, having her legs chomped after falling from a ladder. Again, I feel really bad because similar to Lambert, she seemingly possesses an intense fear of these sharks swimming about, which reminds me of Lambert's death in the original Alien, where she's simply too petrified to even move, despite having the brief chance to escape her demise when Parker distracts the creature, while in this movie, Janice struggles to reach in a state of panic, and while doing so, she inevitably meets her fate. Tom Scoggins is another character who suffers a tragic demise through the sharks, and similar to Janice, his death is predictably set up. They even spoiled it in the trailer, and besides that, I only remember the guy for his corny lines.
Someone order the fish? You trust me. You know why? Because I'm trustworthy.
I laughed at that. Carter Blake, as I mentioned way earlier, is a shark wrangler who works for Aquatica with the sole purpose of meeting the terms of his parole. Now, how exactly did he get himself in that position? Asides that, however, Carter is easily one of the most level-headed members of the Aquatica crew, being the only person within the facility to actually have an idea of what they're actually dealing with. His first few scenes do a good job at introducing us to his character, in addition to showing his abilities and survival skills, which later come into play when faced against the sharks. He also has this weird, almost non-existent relationship with Susan. The relationship was so important it got ditched halfway in. Now, taking his introduction into consideration, the idea of Carter surviving isn't really a surprise when you think about it. The setup was pretty obvious, and his survival skills and knowledge made for a dead giveaway. But Preacher, on the other hand, is a completely different story. Sherman Preacher Dudley is a cook who cooks in the kitchen, and he is easily the funniest cook we have. Like, damn, the screenwriters really cooked in the writer's room, and I'm surprised the script didn't burn itself in the process. He is literally no business being this good, and you can thank both LL Cool J and director Harlan for the final outcome. Initially, LL Cool J's character was meant to be killed off early, but the director was so impressed with Jay's performance that he ultimately decided to keep him in. But hiring James for the role, however, was not easy. Apparently, Harlan had to force the studio to hire the rapper, and the reasoning behind this was to have a character who could bring a lot of humor to the film without devolving into joke-type humor. Now, despite some of the problems I have, Deep Blue Sea is still a very entertaining movie. I don't actually mind the idea of revisiting it in the future, because even with the knowledge of all the twists and turns they have in store, Deep Blue Sea remains a fairly rewatchable film, and it has since gained a very small but dedicated following, which includes me, of course. And if you still haven't seen it, go fucking see it then.
Check it out! Because I completely forgot. Jerry! Oh no, Jerry!